Welcome back, everybody, to Culz Interviews. This week we are diverting from our recent topics, I suppose, but kind of touching more upon one that we kind of sprinkled our toes in a little bit earlier on our channel. But we got a pretty intriguing book here, and we got the author, David, and he wrote Interviewing a Jesus the Man, which I'm pretty sure this is the only book written like this. So if there is another one, I apologize, but I just thought it was such a cool idea. Before I go rambling and take over the interview, I will let David introduce himself.
It was very important for me in my own spiritual journey to explore a figure that I knew only theologically. And I felt after spending a great deal of time investigating religions and Christianity in particular, that I wanted to bring something to the table that I think has been lost since the first century. And so I've had a number of kind of mystical experiences, and I've also had a huge library on Christianity. And I just felt that I was seeing Jesus in a very new light, and I wanted to share that light in a book. And when I first started to deal with this material, I really had no idea exactly how I wanted to write the book. And then I kind of, a friend of mine just said, well, why don't you try writing just fiction about it? And at that point, it kind of clicked onto me as to how to go about formatting the book in the way that it was. And I chose an interview process. To me, I always like to be around, usually with one or two people, and have a conversation over a cup of coffee. And that's how I felt that I should conduct this type of interview. So it was an imaginary interview with Jesus. Even though it's fictional, there is a great deal of research that I have done, especially in the first century. And I also had to do a bit of exploration into the religions of that time. And I also had to look into Greek history and Egyptian history and Roman history to kind of get a pretty good idea of, what the conditions were and how I wanted to go about conducting this interview. So there was a great deal of research to it as well.
Yeah, and that's something that I really enjoy personally when we do our videos is just the research, because it's always finding these little like nuggets and stuff that you're like, oh, that's so cool. I can't wait to share that. So obviously you got some biblical text, but do you want to kind of walk us down through the research and how that actually looked?
There were several parts to this, and that was what was happening in the first century of Judea. Who were the Romans? What kind of Greek influence was there? And what kind of Egyptian influence was there? And if you kind of think about it, Judea and Israel are surrounded. One, you have on the west side, they're surrounded by the Mediterranean. But in the north, you have what is Turkey and Syria. So you had those empires. Down in the south, you had the Egyptian Empire. And in the east, you have the Medo-Persians and the Babylonians. And then in the west, there was the Greeks and the Romans. And so at this particular time, when Jesus was born, there was no Roman occupation. That came somewhere around by the time he was either 6 or 10 years old. Actually, I take that back. This is difficult to kind of put a figure on, because there's at least a 10-year gap between what the gospel writers write and when the first Roman governor showed up. So when they say that Jesus, in the time of Herod the Great, that man died in the year 4 BC, and the first Roman governor was in 6 AD. So we have those, we use CE and BC a little differently, but anyway, there's a 10-year difference. We don't really know Jesus's true time of birth, because it says that in the time of the governor. So that would have been 6 BC, but they say that it was Herod the Great, time of Herod the Great.
Yeah, and so I mean that's got to be pretty difficult for you as you're going through, is trying to find the timeline and also trying to go into the right era as far as where you can research.
When I finally started to read or write the book, I had already done this research, and I already had spent I'm going to say the good part of 15 years or more, looking into just the historical context of this. And I never really thought that I would be writing a book. So it wasn't until I think around 2015 or 2016 when the ideas started to kind of come to me that it would be interesting or it would be important for me to write this book.
I guess everyone probably has a preconceived idea of Jesus, right? Now, before going into this book, what was like your idea? Like before going into your research, I should say.
When I was in my early 20s, I had several mystical experiences that kind of pushed me into Christianity, and so it was from there that I really kind of dove into Christianity and went to church, et cetera, et cetera. And then I started to read the material of and the books of Thomas Merton, and Thomas Merton got me interested in looking at the Christian mystics. And from the Christian mystics, I went into more historical context. So there was kind of trying to understand what the Bible had to say. Then there was the my interest in the theological point of view. Then there was Thomas Merton, who was a Trappist monk, and what he had to write. And then the whole Christian mystic library, I ended up spending a lot of time with. And then after that, I ended up looking more into the historical context. And that was when things really kind of started to kind of converge, because there were several different threads in which I started to weave this story. So there was the theological perspective, there was the mystical side, and then there was the historical context. And I felt that all three of those relationships needed to at least have some say in the work that I wrote. So
From your research, how accurate do you think, Jesus was depicted in not only his time, but more of our time and how the Bible's set up today?
one of the things that I had to do, and this is also part of my own healing that I've gone through, and that is I spent some time with psychologists, and I also spent some time with Jungian analysts analyzing my dreams. So I started to develop an insight into personality traits. And from there, I started to ask myself, what kind of personality trait can I apply to Jesus? And what kind of person would he be? So when you look into the Gospels, you'd go, okay, are these historical? And so since we don't have anything out pretty much outside of that, I mean, there might be, material out there, but I didn't have it. And so what we have is the Gospels, and there are what I know of, there are five major ones, and then there's a number of minor ones. So we have the four that are canonized in the New Testament. There is the Gospel of Thomas, and then there's also a number of smaller Gospels that are out there, like the Gospel of Philip. So with that, I had to take as much as I could from that context, and then I had to apply what the Romans brought to the table and what the Greeks brought to the table. And then I also had to understand what was going on with the Jewish concepts and with Jewish theology. And with that, I then had to kind of weave Jesus's story in there. So I have to kind of just mention that when we look at the New Testament, there is historical references and there is historical facts in there. The way in which the Jewish people wrote, and this is very important because the way that they understood truth was very different than, say, the way the Greeks and the Romans looked at truth. The Greeks started what we would understand as really kind of fact-based history. So they really wanted to understand what happened, when did that happen, who was involved with this happening. When it came to the Jewish the mind, facts were important, but the story and the truth behind the story was more important. It was how that story is told to get to the actual truth of what they're getting at, what they want you to see. So the facts and the truth are told in two different accounts. So you have a Greek account and you have a Jewish account. And the Jewish account is their truth is more storytelling. What is the point of this particular story, and how do I sharpen that pencil to tell that particular story? So facts are only as good as the emphasis on the story. So when you get into the Gospels, we're seeing part of this blend between historical fact and types of truth and how you tell a truth. So when you look at the New Testament, we're looking at a blend of both history and storytelling. So it was important to understand not only that idea, but also then to like try to gleam out of what was the original content and what is the content that was added after Jesus. Everything was added after Jesus's death. So how do you square that circle between what Jesus actually said and did versus what his followers and what other people said that he did? And sometimes it's not so easy to be able to distinguish what is fact and what is fiction in that regards. However, when I started to really kind of bear down with the material that I was working with, I went with what Jesus said. And from that, I took each of his sayings. And of course, there's some of his sayings overlap in both the Gospel of Matthew, the Mark, and Luke. Uh, so I didn't want to just go ahead and repeat his saying 3 times from 3 different sources. So I ended up compiling his sayings, the most authentic of his sayings, in one document. And that turned out to be 25 pages. So just imagine, you know, 12 font, 25 pages. And that told me quite a bit right then and there. Who in their right mind was walking around writing down all of these parables and all these aphorisms in which you've compiled 25 pages from? That seemed really kind of difficult to me. And then once I broke those sayings down into different subject matters, then I started to see what did Jesus say the most? What was the number 1 thing? What was the number 2 thing? What was the number 3 thing? And so in that order, Jesus spoke about money and treasure was his number 1 topic that he talked about. The second thing that he talked about was food. And the third thing that he's talked the most about was the kingdom of heaven. And after that, you have a lot of teaching. So the question is, was he going around saying the same thing over and over and over again? Or was he inventing his own parables and his own stories to tell the spiritual truths that he knew? And how did all of this blend into the current affairs of what was taking place in Judea at that particular time?
Yeah, and before I let Sam get into more of like Jesus, let's set the stage for the audience and kind of explain what the world was like that Jesus was born into, like politically and like religiously. Like there's a lot of turmoil and changing of tides at that time too.
That's correct. There's a great deal of sending out these henchmen to go out and kill the firstborn child. Okay, that never happened. So, however, what did happen is that Herod the Great, who we all know, or at least we think we know, had multiple wives and he had at least 10 children. He ended up killing his own children. So there's the infanticide. And he also killed his own daughters. He was not a full Jew. He was a half Jew. He was half Arab. This was a problem to those Jews who felt that you needed to be part of a bloodline. He was not. The fact that he was going around killing his own family was a big problem. The other thing that that was part of what he was involved in, one was a massive kind of new economic boom. So he was building all kinds of things, cities, harbors, marinas, his palaces, Masada, he built that. So there was a big building boom was going on. The second temple was being built, but he gave the priest, the high priest, kind of leeway to do whatever they wanted to do with the temple. And one of his benefactors was Rome, and so the Romans gave him a free hand. So with that, what he did and what the priests were doing were making sacrifices to the Romans. Okay, well, try to imagine a very religious culture like the Jews at that time, And the idea that you would be making sacrifices to the Romans, blood sacrifices, was a sacrilege. And so there was a great deal of protest taking place at the time, and there was a great deal of consternation. Anyway, that was part of it. There was also the Greco-Roman world was the best way to describe it is, and this is what happened to me. So one day I was with my family, and I was up in Las Vegas, and I went into Caesar's Palace, and I looked around at all the sculpture, and I went, "Oh my God, this is exactly what was going on in Judea at the time of Jesus." At the same time, so just think of like Las Vegas is a little bit of Rome. Okay, then we had the whole crisis years ago with the Taliban and with ISIS. And remember how ISIS blew up the temple, the Roman temple in Syria. Well, those people are very, very religious, and they recognize the importance of their religion. So you had that level of element with this Greco-Roman world. And the Greco-Roman world had, they were interested in the body, they were interested in philosophy, they were interested in gyms, they were interested in man as the measure of all things. So this was a clash of culture on a grand scale. So not only did you have Herod the Great going around doing what he was doing, which was really, he was trying to please two worlds. He was trying to please both the Roman world, and he was also trying to please the Jews, and he seemed to not be able to do either very, very well. So there was a lot of consternation and distrust. Okay, at the same time, the Romans were building temples in and around the Galilee. And then, as I mentioned earlier, every day the priests had to make sacrifices to Rome. They went out into the desert in Qumran, and they kind of left the world to kind of run by itself.
Yeah, no, it's definitely a
It was a
very, very
mess. It was a
interesting
complete
time.
mess.
Yeah.
Plus, there was a great deal of taxes. So you're being taxed for all these palaces that Herod was building, and then he was out. He was not even a full-blood Jew, and he was. It turns out that he was killing his own children and his wives.
Yeah,
So
and back then, it's a lot. I mean, I guess we probably have places where they still kind of can get away with that, but back then it was maybe a little bit easier to kind of sweep that stuff under the rug, where even the citizens, they don't want to speak up to the people above them too much. It's very, very dangerous to do that, we should say. And
Well, at the time of Jesus's birth, this is quite interesting, and this was when I found this out, I was actually quite surprised. So, in the book of Acts, there are two references to a man by the name of Judas the Galilean, and I had to go into Josephus, who was the Jewish historian at the time, and find out who he was. And lo and behold, Judas the Galilean, who was from Galilee, same place as Jesus, went around on a killing spree. So he felt that any Jew who acquiesced to Roman law and to Roman taxation was not a Jew, and therefore they weren't free to be Jews, and therefore they deserved to be killed. And so he and his followers went around killing and slaughtering an enormous amount of people in the Galilee. And this is at the same time that Jesus was born.
yeah, and it's
So
just
the idea that
terrible.
he was doing what he was doing, it makes a lot of sense that his parents were kind of fleeing this turmoil,
Mhm.
which is why they left where they left. That's kind of part of the way that I see this story being told, is that they were leaving to go to this, uh, record their census.
Yeah, and it makes a lot of sense when you lay it out that way, as far as where they are and why they're going away. And it's just a very, very dangerous time. And I'll let Sam talk a little bit so that I have a bad habit of just like hijacking these interviews and like talking over him. So Sam, do you want to talk a little bit?
So, what kind of a man was Jesus?
Oh, that's a very good point. So this was part of the profile that I had to develop for him
Mhm.
and of him. And you would think, oh, he was just kind of a maybe, you'd think of a hippie, a little bit of a flower child, flower power kind of child. And that can't be further from the truth. So one of the things that Jesus brought to the table was one, he was extraordinarily compassionate. He was extraordinarily intelligent. In fact, I call him a genius. Um, he was what we would call a troublemaker. So try to imagine what that must have been at that time. He was a provocateur. He was very enigmatic. He felt everybody needed to be included into his ministry. He was a teacher, and he was a mystic, and he was very, very tough, and he was a poet. So think about all those personality traits all rolled up into one. So yeah, I mean, he didn't back down from people, and he confronted everybody kind of on equal terms, and he included almost everybody into his fold. And he also was very bent, and he felt compelled to see that the Jewish religious establishment had kind of gone off the rails in his mind. So he called them whitewashed tombs. So he was willing to criticize people and point things out to them and confront them for who they were and what they were doing.
Which, like you said, is very, very dangerous during those times. Obviously, we see the consequences of that much later, but
And you have to imagine, I looked at his life and just said, okay, I'm going to make a term here. It's called feats of endurance. So if you think about the feats of endurance that Jesus engaged in, one of the first ones was to go get baptized. Well, where he lived versus where John the Baptist was doing his baptism at the river Jordan was over 90 miles away. So how many people walk 90 miles? Not many. So you had to already be physically fit. The next thing he did is he went out into the desert for 40 days and 40 nights, fasting, drinking a little water. You have to be really, really fit to do that. Then he went around, once he started his ministry, he started walking around everywhere in that region. And so I know how difficult it is. You have to be on all the time. You have to kind of have the space to be present with people. And at the same time, you have to be teaching people. And I know that, how taxing that is on an emotional level. So Jesus was, having to be taxed on a physical level and then on an emotional level. And I also believe that he was also receiving all kinds of information from the Father. And then finally, the last feat of endurance was what happened to him when he was down in Jerusalem during Passover. So he was willing, as I look at it, it was a willing sacrifice to go down there and cause trouble, which is very consistent with what his ministry was about. And he was willing to let that all play out.
Mhm.
So there's another feat of endurance. So this man was a very, very tough man. Very, very tough.
yeah, no
And very
doubt
physically
there.
fit.
You would have to be. I think a bunch of people, for the most part, kind of were back then. But
It's a very physical time.
Yeah,
true.
It's
I
a
know
very
what-
physical time. They
No
didn't have the
no
automobiles like we
automobiles.
have today.
So why did he conduct his ministry?
Yeah, that's a very good point. That's a very, very good point. Obviously, he felt that there was something missing and lacking in in Judea. And one of the things that I did was once I laid out all of his sayings that are the most authentic, I started to look in where these inspirations came from. And this is very important because there are a number of sayings that have, and a number of ideas that are um, ideas that you would find in the East. So with Buddhism and Taoism and Hinduism. So I felt like one of the things that he was attempting to accomplish was to bridge the spiritual gap between what was happening in Judea at the time and Eastern religion. At the same time, there is a reference in the Gospels in which Jesus felt his heart was open and he felt that these people needed some guidance and he wanted to fill that gap. So he was taking everything that he learned, like I said, the influences are quite extensive here. So there is some Egyptian, there is a great deal of history into in the Jewish histories, and there's a Greek influence, and then there is the Taoist influence, and then there's the Hindu influence, and then there is the Buddhist influence. In fact, his ministry is, from what I can tell, primarily a Buddhist concept. So where did that come from, right? It's not from the Jews. In fact, he even says in a very Buddhist way, the less I become, the more the Father becomes, the greater the Father becomes, right?
Yeah.
And that's the loss of ego.
Which is, something it's hard for people to do. So, I mean, that's a test of feat in itself, right? To let
Right.
go of that. Because it's almost a natural thing. Like we have that ego kind of built into us anyway. So to kind of, I mean, obviously he was totally able to separate it. But I mean, that's pretty hard to do, right?
So Jesus had an open mind, he had an open heart, and the trying to eliminate the ego, and it was being supplemented by his compassion. And that is highly Buddhist.
Yeah. And so before we get to the East, because I do have some more questions that I've kind of collected from other interviews that I just want to get your opinions on. But let's get to an influence that maybe is a little bit closer to home. Like, what is his influences from his direct family, as far as where he was raised and stuff?
So there's a misconception that Jesus was poor. He wasn't. He came from it's hard to understand exactly, what kind of wealth he came from, but it definitely was way above anything else. So in the Gospel of Luke, there's a reference to his mother being a woman of means. So right there, that tells you Jesus came from wealth. However, this is where it got really fascinating for me, is so that when I took all of Jesus's sayings, and I remember I said, money and treasure was one of the number one things that he talked about. When I analyzed those sayings, there are four basic components to those sayings when it comes to money. One is that you have you're a merchant and you're selling something. Two, you're kind of in the labor pool, meaning you're the one that's having to deal with this. There's there's another one that's a managerial position, and then there's one that inherits money, and I can't remember the other one, but anyway, it seemed to me that once I started to analyze just how much business was in those sayings, it made me believe that there was no way Jesus could understand that without being around that all the time. So he brought to his ministry a type of entrepreneurial spirit in which he knew that there was a product, and that product that he's bringing to the table was the Father, and he saw all these people out there as an opportunity to share that with Judea. So that's why I call him an entrepreneur.
Yeah, and I mean, you see, he was able to build stuff pretty much out of nothing, as far as he was just able to attract people, and that's not easy, and that's another trait that he had to have had, was just a magnetic personality, right?
That's correct. He had a highly magnetic personality, and that was part of the troublemaker and the kind of the provocateur that I saw of him, and that is in contrast to, say, what we know of from his brother James. So again, in the Bible and outside of the Bible, there are some references to James, and you kind of just see that Jesus was probably the firstborn in that family, and he probably was head and shoulders above everybody when it came to intelligence and wit. When you look at what he said and how he said it, you can start recognizing just how facile he was at, one, creating the stories, and then two, how he was able to respond to people who were critics of him right off the bat. So, and this goes back to Greek rhetoric that he was engaged in. So not only is he a storyteller, but when he was attacked verbally, he had a way of diffusing that assault very, very quickly through words. And that takes an enormous amount of talent to be able to do that.
Exactly. And I guess we've talked about the traits a little bit, and you did mention profiling. And this is actually something I wanted to talk about, was just making a profile, because it's almost like a unsolved case that you're kind of fitting characteristics in to build this picture. So tell us, how do you build a profile from just I mean, we got a lot of records, but you have to sift through truth and not.
So when I was younger, I played a lot of sports. And so I thought, I had to ask myself, if Jesus is considered an MVP, right, in baseball, what does it take to become a baseball player and then go through the entire training process to become as skilled as he was? So that was one thing that I asked. The other thing that I asked was, did Jesus just one day wake up and look at his family and he said, "Hey, everybody, I think today I'm going to go conduct my ministry"? No. How do you prepare for something like that? So something had to get him to the spot where he felt that he could do this. And that's what was really intriguing. The other part to that was, how did he come up with his ideas? Because those are very advanced ideas. When he says in the Gospel of John, the Father and I are one, where did that come from? Because that is not a Hebrew concept. If you think, if you know the way the Christians say it, oh, well, he was the Son of God, therefore it is all. But I didn't look at it that. I just took all that and I said, I'm going to take that and put that aside. All the theology, I'm just going to put aside, and I'm going to try through just the power of my own observation, what kind of person was this? And here's the other thing that's very important. I felt that when I looked at all of those sayings, I felt that Jesus was telling me about himself. So a lot of those sayings were inspired by his own life experiences. And that kind of told me something about him. He is telling me what kind of experiences he had. He was also telling me something about what was going on in his society, that he felt that he was going to be he was going to solve that particular problem. So he saw something that he needed, that needed something to be solved, and he wanted to be the one to help out with that.
And you brought up the East earlier, and you brought up Buddhism and stuff like that. And so let's kind of shift into him going out east. To him, obviously, is Asia, and all that, the travels and what influenced him out there.
Right. So as I was going through and looking at the his life and his ministry, I had to ask myself, where did he learn all this traveling? He's walking everywhere. Usually the way things worked back then is that you just set up a shop in a location and everybody came to you. Jesus flipped the whole thing upside down. He's going from one place to another, to another, to another, to another. So in the in the early phase of his life, and we only have just a few sentences in which we know something about him, up until 12. And then after that, I don't think we know anything until he was 30. He shows up, John the Baptist. But in that space between the time he was born to the 12 years old, we know that he went down to Egypt. Well, what was he doing down there? So that meant right then we have some sense of traveling. We see his parents traveling from one place to another. We now know that he went from Jerusalem at least down to Egypt. And then we see within his ministry, he's always walking around and traveling. He's going up and down the coast. He's going into Tyre and Sidon. He's going to the east. He's going to Qumran. Where did all that come from? And especially if he had a family, most likely I felt like his family they were either merchants or they owned some type of, plantation has a very bad connotation right now. But his parents probably had some kind of plantation, because they were always, everything that he talked about was buying and selling and labor that's involved with how you take a product and move it out into the marketplace. He knows that really, really well. And my feeling is that his father had enough money to get him into some of the best places to learn. And obviously, I think that there was some business connections down in Egypt. So then, when I started to look at his sayings, and I went, "Hey, where does this concept of the Father and I are one?" I mean, that's Hindu. And then, as I mentioned earlier about Buddhism, that's in the East. And then there's the Taoism. So part of his Taoism was, Consider the lilies of the field. They don't toil. Okay, well, that's Taoism. So how is he getting all this information? And where is that coming from? At the same time, he understands Greek rhetoric. Where'd that come from? And then when I looked at the Essenes, and I listed all the things that the Essenes were interested in, and then I looked at all the things that Jesus was interested, I noticed that there was a great deal of overlap. And then there was a complete distinction in which that overlap stopped and Jesus went in a different direction. Okay, there's that influence. But if you go down to the influences of the of Asia, the route that I found out was that you go down to the Red Sea, you catch a boat, and you go to Yemen. From Yemen, then you catch another boat, and you take the trade winds, and it takes you directly to the west coast of India. And there was a route. And so it doesn't surprise me that Jesus was on that route. And then, of course, there's later traditions, and his name was Isa. There's a man named Isa, and there's all kinds of stories of him being in India. So my guess is that he learned when I mentioned earlier about the feats of endurance, it seemed like Jesus was a very physical man, and he learned how to manage his body. And that is a part of a martial arts. So, and then the Buddhist idea of letting go of the ego, that's not necessarily Jewish. So something's going on over there.
And so this is where I wanted to kind of get your opinion on, because I know there's a town in Japan, I think it's called Shingo, that claims to have the grave of Jesus.
I haven't heard this. So
I didn't hear about it until recently, and I was like, well, good thing we're having David on, because he's a lot more research than I.
Getting over to Japan at that time, it would have been very difficult, I think.
Okay.
Okay, here's one thing. There is no Silk Road at this time. That didn't show up until the 2nd century, that opening. There were parts of the road, but it wasn't a full road from China all the way into the Mediterranean. That didn't happen until the 2nd century. So the question is how far can you go, right? Can you get around that tip of India and then go down, through Thailand and then up that other way and then past, the eastern edge of China and then over into Japan?
Well, yeah,
that would have been a
Japan
long
was
trip.
super hard to get into anyway, as far as heavily fortified and stuff like that.
Well, it wasn't until I think 1863 that the Americans showed up with Commodore Perry in Japan. And prior to that, there weren't a whole lot of, influences until, there were influences starting around 1400. But if you get into, any period of time before that, that seems highly unlikely. But I'm not saying that it didn't happen. All I'm saying is that, boy, that's one heck of a feat to get all the way over on that side.
Here, I pull it up, try to show you.
Oh, wow. There's the cross.
Right. And so I would pull it up so I could get a little information, because I just heard about it and I wanted to get more of because their story goes a lot different than obviously the story we know of, where he gets, crucified. In their story, he lives to the age of 106. And at that grave, they're supposed to have the Virgin Mary's lock of hair and stuff like that. So
so that could have been part of, once the Portuguese. So the Portuguese and the Spanish were pretty big on doing the exploration at that time, or back in the 1300s, 1400s. Of course, then there's the Templars, and so we kind of have some idea that the Templars were world traders. So, again, but they didn't show up until 1099. And then after that, the Portuguese and the Spanish were the ones that were going around. It wasn't until Magellan that we went west, and then down to Tierra del Fuego and then into the Pacific from that point of view. So my guess is that Christianity was brought to Japan probably by the Portuguese in, I don't know, late 1300s, early 1400s, maybe. And here's the other thing. I believe that that cross that we see, and we say that that's, the Roman cross. I don't know if that was the true shape. My feeling is that the way the Romans worked, there wasn't anybody hewing out a whole bunch of logs, and then, either bolting them or making lap joints to put those two things together. Most likely they just took branches that were fairly thick. My guess is somewhere in the neighborhood of about 3 inches, and cut them to roughly equal lengths, strap them together in the form of an X, and their crucifixions were X-shaped. And then what they would do is then lean the condemned up against a pole. That is a much easier way of doing everything.
Yeah, I was gonna say I saw a documentary sometime where they were testing. It might have been in Mythbusters, I don't know, but they were testing that theory of like what the shape of the cross was, and the X shape works a lot better as far as holding an actual human body up
Yes,
versus the cross that we've come to know.
exactly. So we have there are some bones and that have been discovered with Roman nails through it, and it's not from the front of the top of the foot through the feet. It's from the side. So chances are that that's the way that he was crucified. And so then he was just leaned up against a pole. So when he had to carry his cross, I mean, you're looking at, this idea that Jesus was carrying like a 6x10. Have you guys
Mhm.
ever carried a 6x10 piece of lumber? I
Yeah.
mean, it's really heavy. And back then you had old growth wood. It wasn't like the stuff that we have today. So um, anything that was like a 6x10, it's just huge. It's just very heavy. So that seemed like, to me, I just felt like the logistics of it just didn't fit. However, the cross in an X shape made more sense.
Yeah, and I think symbolism is something that can morph over time. As far as like, it's not hard to see how an X could get put into like a cross,
Yeah, you
you just turn it.
rotate it 45 degrees.
And another big symbol is like the fish. Like, do you want to kind of describe the fish and maybe where that comes from?
Yeah, so the fish is Pisces. It's the age of Pisces. We're going through the processions of the equinoxes in which different constellations are in different positions in the night sky, and so Pisces just happened to be it. So Pisces is actually two circles coming together, and they overlap a little bit, right?
Mhm.
So it's kind of it's part of a sacred geometry shape.
Yeah, which sacred geometry is something that maybe another time we can get into, but it's a fascinating topic. All the ratios and stuff.
Yes.
So one thing that's obviously big today is like heaven or the kingdom of heaven. Do you want to explain maybe Jesus's viewpoints versus our viewpoints on that?
Well, there's a movie that I just watched, and a friend kept saying you should probably watch this, David. It was called Heaven is Real, and in it, the little boy goes to heaven.
Mhm.
So there is some, I think, extra dimensional something, but and I probably my guess is that Jesus knew something about that, but he kept saying the kingdom of heaven is inside of you, and so there was something about the connection that he had with the Father, and that he felt that we all had the same connection. So he kept saying, the kingdom of heaven is inside of you, which throws into an interesting concept about what if the kingdom of heaven is inside of you, why do you need the temple with all the sacrifices? And so I think that Jesus kind of made a line and an exclamation point saying that the kingdom of heaven is inside of you and that you are the temple of God. Well, that's very different. So now he's actually, not only is he throwing a new concept out there, but he's actually challenging the temple and the priests of that temple. So yeah, I think that there is something that Jesus recognized and he was completely in alignment with, to have these like paranormal experiences, and he recognized that they were inside of him as opposed to an external place. So I think that when you kind of get into UFOs these days and the Book of Enoch and whatnot, um, is it possible that there was some spaceships flying around? Probably. Did somebody get on board one of those? According to Enoch, he did. When you read some of the Enuma Elish, from the Sumerians, you're going to start seeing some of these concepts that are in that. And then once you read those, you're going to see the correlations and the similarities in the Old Testament. So yeah, there's probably some extraterrestrial activities that were going on that were, kind of outside the realm of human understanding. That's my belief. In fact, when you kind of look at some of the things in the Old Testament and the way in which the language is used, and now with some new interpretation of that language, we can see that it's not necessarily the way that they described it. There's other ways of looking at this.
Yeah, Sam, do you have anything to ask regarding the like ETs or anything like that?
Let's talk about his like his shroud. Did you know anything about his like shroud that he had? Like that was like mystical shroud.
Well, when you look at the Essenes, one of the things that they talked about is that you should have one robe. Okay, so these are people that are highly dedicated to God, and they wanted to live their life in a very pure and simple way. And they felt that your robe should be one robe, and one robe fits all, and you should wear it all the time, and you should like not really take it off. So I think that Jesus's robe was very consistent with the way the Essenes described what they wanted. I would like to point out that when I was in Rome, I got to see a copy, like almost an identical copy of the Shroud of Turin. And when I looked at that, I went, that, in the strangest way, is an X-ray. It's as if, and I think it was Jesus, was inside of that, and he instantly changed into light. And so his body kind of went through a decomposition instantaneously, and his light body came shooting out of that. And then what we see is the remnant on the backside of that cloth. And from the way that I'm beginning to understand things, Jesus went through the whole, get rid of the ego. I become less, the Father becomes more. Death is not the end of our existence. And then there was the other part of ascension. And when Jesus, after his death, he comes back and people recognize him, but they recognize him only not as a corporal body, but more as a light body. So I think that there is a form of his ministry that moved him into a state of ascension. And the more he got rid of this body and the ideas associated with the body, all the fear and all the anger and all the jealousy and all those things. In fact, if you read a lot of what his golden rules were and all those other things, in fact, I got a list right here of all the things that he said. These are just kind of the starting point of his teaching to kind of transform you and your body so that you can start having more of these types of mystical experiences. But I think at some point that he went through a complete transcendence. And the Shroud of Turin points in that direction. So it's not something that happens out there, it's something that happens within yourself.
There. Well, do you want to talk upon the flaming wheels in the sky and the burning bush?
So are you referring to the Ezekiel wheels? Yeah, isn't that, it's kind of wild. Yeah, it's facets. These are wheels that are inside wheels, and there are certain facets that have different colors. So there must have been some type of, spinning light that was taking place. The burning bush also is very peculiar because it's full of light, right? And that the whole Jews for 40 years are going out in the desert and they're following this light, and the light is leading them around. I can't explain it. I mean, obviously, somebody says that it's God. I don't know what that is, but it's obviously something, because it seems to be part of their tradition in which they kind of came out of Egypt and into this place. So again, and this is, I think, that you find in Jesus, is that Egypt represents one thing, and then as you transition from one thing to another, there is a guiding light that happens. And I think that that's part of the process that Jesus is like pointing to. So
Yeah.
you're leaving the body, so to speak, the kind of the you would say, kind of the earthly man, and there is a guiding light that is taking you step by step through this process of ascension, death, and resurrection and ascension. And
Have
it's a psychological, and it's probably a physical thing. I haven't reached that point, but conceptually, it seems like it's there.
Speaking about the burning bush, have you looked into like St. Catherine's Monastery that claims to have like the actual burning bush?
No, but I know that St. Catherine and a number of these kind of monasteries have ancient libraries. And these libraries now scholars are going to, and they are photographing the books and they're now analyzing them. It's a little bit like what happened in the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Nag Hammadi library. There are libraries out there that are preserved, and they have, they go back over, 1,000, 1,500, 2,000 years. There is information out there. And the question is, how does that information come into our world, and how much of that do we need? I kind of feel that some of the things that we are talking about requires a new language and kind of a new image. And in Christianity, even though there might be a lot of truth to it, I think that it is labored and burdened by a lot of stigma, and it's hard to get around. So is there something else out there? And of course, I'm not a big believer in the idea that you're born, in original sin and that you are in a sinful state. I think more like you're a human being living in a human body, and you're never awakening to the spiritual powers that are inside of you. And our societies aren't teaching any of that. So they just say, go worship God, go think of this, and believe in this. So, and believe in our doctrine. And I don't think that that was accurate. And Jesus was totally against that idea.
Well, and
In
there's
fact,
so
let
much.
me just point this out. Okay, so think about this for 1 second, because this was really important for me when I was going through this. If you were thinking, and goes from the Passover and all throughout, like the Roman occupation, if you're looking for a Messiah, and the Messiah is an anointed one, and the anointed one is the one that you can kind of look to for guidance and for, God's grace. Why is Jesus not talking about the ideas of, when back in the day when David had to fight Goliath? He doesn't say that. Back in the day when Moses had to leave, the Israelites, he doesn't say any of that. He says the kingdom of heaven is within you. And then he goes through the kingdom of heaven sayings, and there are 22 sayings with 9 themes. Okay, check out this. Here are the kingdom of heaven sayings. These are the themes: planting and sowing, children, right? The king of heaven is like the little children. The kingdom of heaven is within you and around you. The pearl, treasure, mustard seed, the strong man, leaven and meal, the unmerciful servant, and workers in the vineyard. There's 10, sorry. There are 22 sayings with 10 themes. The kingdom of heaven. The kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed. What's that all about? Not,
Right.
hey, let's go out there just like David and go slay Goliath. Let's overthrow the government. Let's go overthrow all this stuff. He didn't have any of those ideas that he was bantering around. And he wasn't out there like Judas the Galilean going around slaughtering people because he didn't agree with them. He had a completely different way of thinking about stuff. In fact, there are 4 really main people in Galilee in the first century. There's Jesus, there's John the Baptist, there's Judas the Galilean, and there's Josephus. And Josephus is the man who wrote the histories of first century Judea, and that's what we really have as a reference point for this material. And all of those people came from the Galilee. So Jesus was preaching love. John the Baptist was preaching repentance, and get ready because the end of is near and God's about to come forth. And Judas the Galilean is going around, hey, you take the census and you pay taxes to Rome, you're as good as dead. And he killed all these people. And then Josephus, he's the one that escaped death to become a Roman citizen and wrote about what was happening in Judea. And he was a rabbi. How bizarre. So you have 4 different concepts of what you need to do, and Jesus happened to be one of those, right? Love your neighbor as yourself.
You laid out like what Jesus was like kind of preaching and talking about, like where you'll find the kingdom of heaven and stuff. So then how does that translate into Rome seeing him as an enemy?
Okay, Rome had two basic criteria. They believed in peace, so they didn't want any troublemakers, and they wanted to make sure you paid their taxes to them. They let a lot of things go except for those two things. So they were not at all interested in having revolt. So did you ever see the movie Spartacus?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, okay. Well, Spartacus was, I think it was in the year 70. So that was 30 years before Jesus was born. And they don't want any kind of insurrection taking place. So they're trying to squelch anything. And they were really, at first, they really weren't interested in all this, Jewish squabbling until it started to impinge upon their authority. And then that's when things started to get a little dicey. And the last thing that the priestly caste with the temple, since they were, the way that everything was ruled was either a religious concept or a political concept. And so those were the two ruling principles at the time. Islam is the same thing. They have the king and then they have the imams. Same thing. Jesus he really didn't have much, he wasn't really attacking Herod the Great as much as like John the Baptist did, but he definitely was after the priests. And they also, wanted to have peace and stability. And so they didn't want anybody undermining their authority.
And so there's someone that travels or is said to travel with him. There's named quite a bit towards the end of his life. And that's Mary Magdalene.
Yes.
What do you think her exact role was, and has she been intentionally lost, or did she just not play a big role?
So when you go back and you read what was going on at that time, and this is a very important point, at least for me it was, and we're seeing this in our own culture today. So if you disagree with somebody today, you're considered a racist or you're considered, a Marxist. And so you get bantered and labeled something. And that was going on at their time too. So and the Romans were involved in that. So when somebody was kind of pushing back on kind of a standard way of thinking, you got labeled. And if you go and you read all the stuff that was being labeled by the Christians, like Mary Magdalene was a prostitute. Oh, there's a smear. Thomas, doubting Thomas. Well, there's a smear. How about, I'm just trying to think of, Peter was a coward. So there's a smear, although he became, the father of the church. But anyway, you're going to see these patterns emerging in which if you were starting to think differently than the group think, then there's an attack against you. And if you read in the Dead Sea Scrolls, you have the righteous one, the righteous priest, and then there's the wicked priest. And so they were smearing too. And they felt like they were the true sons of Zadok, the true sons of Aaron, and that they should be running the temple. And so there's all kinds of impure practices that were taking place. And part of it is because they were the priests were making daily sacrifices to Rome and to Caesar. My feeling is that if somebody's being smeared, there's a reason why that they're being smeared, and there should be some investigation and some grain of salt in that. And so I felt that there was something about Mary, there's something about Mary that was very important and was trying to be minimized. And my feeling is that Jesus and Mary were much closer, much closer than the way the Gospels describe it. In fact, in the Gospel of Thomas, Jesus is, or Peter is upset. Well, some of the disciples are upset that Jesus is spending a lot of time with Mary and that Jesus is sharing ideas with Mary that they themselves did not receive. If you think about what Jesus was saying on some of his more profound spiritual concepts, these people, as then they were fishermen, had really no capacity to understand and follow what he was saying. In fact, I think most of the times they had no clue as to what he was saying. So, they were always asking questions like, well, what does this mean? And what does that mean? And what does this mean? And so anything deep, he had to tailor his message to people that can understand it. And then I'm sure that he had probably a few people like Thomas and most likely Mary Magdalene that were capable of understanding his deeper concepts. But what we're seeing in the Gospels are, kind of, they deal with the heart, right? The Gospel of Thomas deals with the mind. So, but I do believe that Jesus probably was married to Mary Magdalene. That's my belief. And that they were married early. And I think that when Jesus started to present her to his community, the community rejected not only him, but they also kind of had to reject her too, because she came in with a whole different kind of understanding and possibly relationship that the Jews felt was impure.
Yeah, and it seems weird that if she's not anyone big, she's right there with him when he's, crucified.
That's correct.
It'd be
And then
very
Luke
odd.
says that she was one of the very wealthy ones that followed Jesus.
Mm.
And so there's another one who followed Jesus, and her name was, it's either Susanna or Joanna. Let me see if I got that note right here. Yeah. Okay. So there were the women of means, and there was Jesus's mother, Mary. There was Mary Magdalene. So there you go. I mean, Mary Magdalene was from a wealthy family. Um, there was another woman by the name of Susanna that we never hear about. And then the other one was Joanna. And Joanna was the wife of Cuza, who was the manager of Herod's household. Wow. So here is the wife of somebody directly in that household. Well, isn't that bizarre?
Well, and then there's the because obviously everyone knows what the idea of the Holy Grail, right? But there was a theory that the Holy Grail was really Mary's chalice when she captured some of the blood that
Mhm.
of Jesus. I mean, what do you think the Holy Grail is? Do you think it's the cup that he drank from at the Last Supper? Do you think there's another chalice? Do you think it was Mary's? Like,
Okay, so if you kind of think about what's going to happen at the Last Supper, uh, one, where is it taking place? And two, who prepared this whole supper? And then three, what kind of instruments that they were using? Was it just, finger food? Who prepared the food? And what kind of cup would you be using in Judea at the time of the Passover? And I don't think it's a chalice. I don't. I think it's probably, one of those pure cups that was, came from a pure stone, and it was, probably a little goblet. And who knows if there was a stem to it or not. I'm not really sure how that would work. But because it was um, kind of an improv, and it was probably what Jesus kind of started to sense that it might be his last meal, you're probably using what you got, right? You're not going to Costco to go buy all this stuff. Now, so when it comes to the idea of the chalice, obviously those are, I think those concepts are added to the story to embellish the story. But the symbolism is actually quite profound. And that is, my feeling is that you are the chalice. You're the one that holds the blood of Christ. You are the one who has within you the true God. You're it. And you're the vessel. That's to me what it means. You're the vessel of God.
yeah, no, that's a very interesting way because I mean, it's obviously a super controversial topic, and people have so many different ideas. There's so many books, but yeah, that's definitely, at the end of the day, more in line with Jesus's teachings, probably as well.
Well, one of the things that I was interested in is I was just, I've done a lot of construction work, so I know what it means I call it nuts and bolts. What bolt needs to go where? What nail needs to go where? What piece of wood do you need? How much is this load going to, take? And so I call it nuts and bolts. So when you start going through all these things, what are the nuts and bolts of this particular feast? What happened? Who prepared this food? What did they prepare? It was a Passover meal. You just showed up. You were in Galilee and now you're showing up. So whose house did you go to? What happened here? So you're not going to, if you kind of think about this for 1 second, there's at least several 100,000 people, okay, at Passover. hundreds of thousands of people. The Temple Mount, I've never been, but it's a huge complex. It can't handle all those people all at the same time. And now you have all these people from all over the diaspora. So you had people from Egypt, you probably had people from Africa, you had people from the Mediterranean, you had people coming in from the Middle East, you had probably people coming in from Asia Minor, which is today Turkey, all coming in to celebrate this. Where are they staying? Where are they going? And how does Jesus seems to have a friend who has this place that he can have this banquet in with his people? How many people were there with him? You know, he says there's only 12. But where was Mary Magdalene? Where are the women? Where's his mother? You don't hear any of that. He says here it's just 12 disciples. But Jesus was always walking around with 60 or more. And apparently came into Jerusalem with a lot of people, right? Everybody praised him. So did he just have the 12 or were there more? My guess is there were probably more. The other thing is that I was interested in trying to understand some of the other influences on this. And I noticed when I read the Egyptian Book of the Dead, there's a number of things that are just directly pulled from there. So, and the Last Supper is part of what was pulled from that, where you take on the god. You drink and eat of the god and you take on their energy. That's very Egyptian. That's not anything that you would hear the Hebrews talk about.
Which again goes back to when you talked about his travels to Egypt.
Yes.
So, and this, I don't know, shall we get controversial? Was Jesus Jewish, Christian, something
Yes.
else?
Well, Christianity doesn't start till after Jesus is dead. So,
Yes.
right. And so there's an idea that Paul is the first Christian. So what we're looking at is Jesus as a Jew living in Judea with a Jewish family that he was born and raised in. And they were living in the first century in a time of turmoil. And then I believe that his mother and his father both recognized that there was something special about him and that they kind of, in a sense, funded his religious education. And one of the things that Jesus was I call him a genius. So they recognized his genius and they also kind of recognized the way in which he told stories. I mean, if you ever learn, people who tell stories have a gift. I'm not one of them. But Jesus obviously did because he has a personality to capture everybody. The other thing that you don't see a lot of what Jesus was doing, he's not acting like a priest or any religious figure. I mean, he was eating and drinking with prostitutes and with the downtrodden. But he had a magnetic personality, but he wasn't like out there to judge people for who they were. He was out there trying to heal and restore people so that they can have a proper relationship with themselves and to others and to God. It was very different, right? So he's not a moralist going out there and says, okay, everybody, you can't do this anymore. He's not doing that at all. In fact, he's constantly confronting all the religious ideas and associations. So like, this is interesting. I went, hey, this is fascinating. Jesus goes out and he fasts for 40 days. After that, you never see him fasting. In fact, one of the things that was being leveled against him by the priests and the religious leaders was, how come you don't honor the fasts? Well, he had already gone through a 40-day of a fast, but he's not honoring any of it. Why? To me, that's fascinating, right?
No, and Jesus always, it seems like more focus on the good rather than point out the bad,
So there's kind of a couple of things that are important here, and that is that there is a idea of a temple construction. And so if you're the temple and we're going to construct you as the temple, there are certain ways of like righteousness, which Jesus really never talked too much about. But the idea is that you had to live a particular way. Okay, so that's one pillar. Then there was another way that you treated other people. That's another pillar. And then there was like the really deep metaphysical understanding of the divine that God had. And I think that was the post or the header, right? And so he was building through his ministry action, how you treat others, how you engage others, how when somebody comes up to you that's very aggressive, how you redirect the energy. He was showing people, show and tell his disciples what to do in tough situations. At the same time, he was teaching them how to act, how to be, how to think. You know, I would imagine if you were a fisherman your whole life, that would have been a big chore. Rough and tumble kind of a guy, you know, all these guys that were out there, you know, they weren't refined. We have a different kind of a thing going on here. And if the more you think about the nuts and bolts of these issues, the more you have to start fitting this puzzle and these pieces into this puzzle. They have to fit together. So there's theology, which is, you know, airy fairy as far as I'm concerned. And then there's like really what happened. So that's why I call it the man, Jesus the man. What happened? These are this is the historical context. This is what he's saying. This is what he did. And, you know, let's just push aside all these other theological ideas and let's just get to the fact of what did it feel like when you're walking 20 miles a day? You know, what do you do at the end of the day? What are you doing during the time? How many people are following you? What happens? And this is really important. When I read about Judas the Galilean, and then I found out through Josephus what towns he went into, I started to then read the New Testament again, and it was like, hey, he's going into the exact same towns that this guy, you know, like 30 years earlier, 20 years earlier, burnt down to a crisp. And he's walking into that village, and he's got a bunch of followers with him. What do you think what's going to happen? Everybody's going to look on him suspiciously. But one of the first things that he's going to say is, peace be with you. Not I come to kill you because, you know, you're following the Romans. That's a nut and bolt kind of issue for me.
Mm-hmm.
So he's trying to get beyond people's fears and suspicions, especially since it's so new. I don't know. Do you guys have any? Are you from the South?
No, I'm from
I have some
Colorado.
friends that are from the South, and you'd think that the Civil War happened yesterday.
From different books I've read, it definitely you can see some of those feelings still coming through, even though these people never even like lived during that time.
Right.
It's still pretty fresh in their minds.
And so that's what I felt when I was reading this material, is that Jesus is walking into a town or a little village and it's all really raw. Somebody died because of this Judas the Galilean. And here's another guy talking about God with all these followers. How did that go over?
So,
and they're already suspicious already, right?
mm-hmm.
The little village towns are very suspicious of other people.
Well, especially back in those days.
Kind of had to be a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing that I thought was very fascinating, I started to think about this, and that was Peter. You know, Jesus says to Peter, kind of at the end of Matthew, "Oh, you're the rock I'm building my church on." It's like, what church?
Right.
What church? Was there a church that he founded? No. Why? Because if he went to village and town to town, where is the church? It's not. It might have been somebody's house. He probably was in there for a very short period of time. Somebody was probably listening to him and they went, hey, you know what? I don't have the time to, you know, follow you. Because he kept saying, follow me, right? So how many people were in his entourage as they were going around? They would have been very suspicious. In fact, if there was more than 3 or 4 people, they were highly suspicious. So just imagine if you were in, you know, if you want to know, like, you know, is there an analogy here? Yeah, try going around with about 100 different, 100 people in Nazi Germany talking about how horrible Adolf Hitler was. You know, that ain't happening. It's just not happening.
Right.
And that's the same thing. It's a very similar kind of condition. So, and if you did do that, you would have had a lot of people paying attention to you because there was a lot of spies. Have you ever been to the Middle East? I have. I've been to Turkey. And boy, I mean, there's spies everywhere. Everybody's a spy. It's very different than here. It's very different.
Yeah, no, I've always wanted to go see some of those temples, but obviously it's just so hard to do that anymore.
Yeah.
But it'd be super cool. So, I mean, obviously you talked about the kingdom of heaven. In modern Christianity, there's another concept, heaven and hell. How much of
Yes.
that was preached or talked about by Jesus?
Well, Hades is Greek, and so it was just it was adopted from that at least from my perspective. It was adopted from that. So Hades was just the underworld.
Mhm.
Sheol was the metaphor in which, after, where do you go after you die, right? So the Jews didn't have an afterlife. The idea is that the kingdom of God was the kingdom that was Judea and Israel. That was what God gave you the land, so that you can live your life in accordance with his concepts, his belief, and and that you're going to be a shining beacon, right? So when you died, no one knew where you went. Immortality was not part of the Jewish equation. That wasn't until the Greeks showed up. So that's Alexander the Great. So once that happened, then they had to start thinking about the nature of the soul, and that's a whole nother kind of concept here. But the Christians end up having to adopt all these different, Greek ideals, and they embedded this. This is why it's fascinating to understand the traditions and the history of these periods. What got blended into Christianity? Christianity is, think of it like a car, in which you have, an engine and a transmission and a differential and a chassis and, a body and some seats and a steering wheel. Christianity, if you kind of broke it all down, it has all these like system components to it. It bolted all of these ideas together to create this vehicle to go out into, for the most part, the Greco-Roman world. And they were very successful doing it.
Mhm.
And so to appeal to when the Jews started, the Jewish Christians, right, the early one, the Way, that's what it was referred to as the Way, were Jewish. And they were trying to practice Jewish laws using Jesus as the influence. He was not the Son of God. There was something else that took over, in which you now worship Jesus. Messiah just means that somebody's been anointed. The way the Christians used it is that they took it and they said, oh, Messiah is the equivalent of God. And it's not. It just means somebody has been anointed. There were many saviors and many anointed people in the world. And most of the people who were super geniuses, like Alexander the Great and Galen, who was a physician, they considered themselves, Christos, Christ, saviors, because they were head and shoulders above everybody else. So Jesus was, in a sense, head and shoulders above a lot of people, but they turned him into a deity. So the question is once you turn something into a deity, and I believe that that's what happened. Jesus, I don't, he's a man, and he even says it. He even calls himself a prophet, right? No prophet, is welcome in his hometown. Well, he's kind of identifying himself as a prophet. And the idea of the Son of God is something that came later. So the Son of God, as it comes later, is trying to work itself out in a period, a Greco-Roman period, in which the true Son of God was the son of the emperor, because the God was the emperor himself. And that's the designation. So now Christianity is starting to compete with Rome by using terms that Rome understands, like Prince of Peace and the Savior and the one who brings peace and ideas like that. All those Christianity is starting to usurp and apply it in their own way against Roman rule. So, and it was a way of appealing to Rome, or to the people within the Roman Empire.
Well, and how much do you think people have now used the idea of Jesus to sell their ideas?
Well, I think that there's been a formalization of that, and so now you have all these different little offshoots of it. But again, who was the one that starts something, right? Who was like Bill Gates, right? When he's trying to create a personal computer, or Stephen Jobs. Well, they have a version of what they want. And now, 40 years later, what does it look like? It's a very different beast because other things have happened. So now you're trying to appeal from the very initial start to something that has taken hold and is now, flourishing out into the world. How do you control all that? How do you manage that? How do you kind of harness all that energy? And those are the concepts that I look at. So this is a social dynamic in a social time in which religion and the concepts of God are very, very important. What's really fascinating about Christianity, it was like kind of head and shoulders different from the Roman pagan gods, is that Jesus, or their God, Jesus and Father God and the Holy Spirit actually cared about you. And that was really appealing, like, hey, if the world is bad, but God loves you and you can have a personal relationship with him. Well, what would you rather have? Would you rather have an impersonal God that's out there to throw rocks at you and make you trip and stumble and, bring catastrophe in your life? Or would you rather have somebody that actually cares about you? Hey, well, it's a no-brainer to me. I'll take this over that.
Yeah, no, the Greek gods were always up to a lot of no good.
Yeah, there's a lot of mischief.
Yeah.
There's a lot of mischief in this.
So there's a story from Colorado of a guy named Francis Slater, I think is his name, in the late 1800s. But he, sometime in the late 1890s, I think, is when he had this like vision or calling where he said he heard the Father. He sells his business, kind of has a ministry. He goes around like healing people. Have you ever heard about him before?
Nope. No, I haven't. So
let me get a picture of him for you. So there's a book called Weird Colorado, and that's where I first heard of him.
Oh.
And this is what he looked like.
Oh, wow, look at that.
I don't know.
He looks a little bit like Rasputin.
Yeah, no, and then just one night he disappeared and said his ministry and his accomplishment was done. So I just didn't know if you had heard about him or anything like that.
I haven't, but I want to mention something. The mind and the way that you can engage, quote, the kingdom of heaven is very, very strong. And we don't teach it at all. So when people have their own intuitions and they start following those intuitions and develop kind of their spiritual muscle, stuff like this, I think, can happen. A lot of, miracles happen. Why? Well, when you get, 100 people praying for you, the mind has a way of creating reality and shaping reality.
No, I mean, that's definitely very true. And, some of our guests have kind of talked about it, like tapping into yourself in a way, like, just opening yourself back up. Because especially today, we're so, I guess, limited because we're so distracted by so many different things. And
there's a lot of white noise out there.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of white noise. So, the trick is to be able to sift through all that noise and cut through it and then harness your own energy. And that's harder and harder to do these days. There's so much to distract. There's a lot to distract you. So, where do you find that vein inside yourself? But anyway, some people have, a natural and intuitive ability to be able to do that. And so they do.
Mm-hmm.
I've had to learn a lot of different things, and primarily it was all through books and, other experiences.
Yeah. And so we've been talking about, the topic of your book, obviously, but when talking with Mark, he brought up that you have some artwork in a museum.
I do. So I have been painting quite a bit, and one of my paintings was selected into the Arizona Biennial. So it's now in the Museum of the Tucson Museum of Art, and it's up there for 6 months. So it's one of I think 50 artists out of 1,000 that was selected.
Very cool.
So I'm very excited. Anyway, I have been making art, most of my life, and so art and spirituality and building seem to be my trinity. So that's why I like the nuts and bolts kind of thing. I mean, I know how to build stuff, so I have to ask myself, where did all this come from? And, I want to look at it that way. And then I also have a very creative side. And then I have kind of a deep level of spirituality. And I'm trying to blend all this stuff together and figure it all out. And it's always a challenge. It's getting easier, but it was a challenge.
Right.
Because there's so much to know, right? There's so much to know, so much to do, so much to experience. And if there's all this noise that we get distracted by, boy, there's another 2 or 3 or 4 hours out of your day that just went by.
Yeah, exactly. And he also said something about Stonehenge in your yard, Stonehenge feature in
I
your
have
yard.
a labyrinth in my yard. Yeah.
Okay.
So it's a 7-ring labyrinth. So when I bought the house, I kind of had some sense that I should go into the front yard, and the front yard is divided up into 3 sections. And so the very far western section of the yard, I just went, um, my wife and I just decided we wanted to go build a labyrinth in there. So we did, and we cleared out everything. And then we brought in some gravel, and all the rocks that make up the rings were all indigenous to our property, with the exception of a few pieces. Yeah, it's great, and everybody drives by, right? Sometimes somebody will stop and go, "Hey, what's that?" And other times, most of the time people just drive by. But
Oh,
I felt
that's
like
cool.
that was important, right? And so sacred sites require kind of sacred energies, and required a space to create that, to allow those energies to come through. I'm a total believer of that. And
Yeah,
I
no.
try to make as much sacred space as I can, right? Peace and harmony. We have more animals here. We have lots of birds. Yeah, it's pretty remarkable.
You talk about sacred sites, and it seems like a lot of times when we find these old monolithic sites, a lot of times it was about being a sacred site or a religious site.
Yeah.
Not that people live there, just people went there to do something religiously or spiritually, something like that.
People were connected I think, in a very different way than we are today. So there's energies in your body, there's energies in the sky, and there's energies in the planet. And so these sacred sites happen to be within particular areas that had lots of energy. And so they knew how to harness that energy. They knew how to put a stone here, or to take this shape and put all this stuff together. And then they ritualized it, and then they came over there and used it on very specific days for very specific reasons.
Mhm.
And I know I've made pilgrimages to French cathedrals, and all of them were on some type of sacred uh, ground, and they just built over them.
I had watched something sometime where they were uh, trying to do some excavations under a church and they found some sacred site and then they just made them stop digging.
Yes,
So I forget which one
that's
that
very
was.
normal. That's very, very normal to take an existing sacred space and then build your your sacred space or your sacred building on top of it.
Yeah, my late Papu had given me a book called The Source, I believe. But they talk about they dig so many feet underground. That's all one civilization. They keep digging
Yes,
just straight underneath. It's another civilization. So they were just
exactly.
building up on top of each other.
Exactly. And then you'll look at these like mountains or hills out there, and then, as you said, the the top is the most recent, and then as you keep going down, there's others that were just built right on top of it.
Mhm.
There are layers and layers and layers of different things that human beings have been involved in
Right.
for a long, long time.
I
And we
mean,
just happen to be at one spot of that, right? And so we are, through our technology and our innovation and our engineering and our materials, we're building what we consider sacred spaces, but who knows? It might even be, sacred interference.
right.
There's a lot of noise going on out there.
Yeah, no, one day we'll be the one of the layers underground, right?
Most it could be, yeah.
So, I mean, you've obviously had to profile Jesus pretty well to write this book, and there's been a lot of movies written or not written, made about Jesus, be it like The Passion of the Christ or he's in Ben-Hur, The Last Temptation of Christ, stuff like that. What is there a movie that you think gets him pretty close to what you think, or
What the movies that end up trying to um, match the Gospels, then what we're seeing is a version of Christianity that needed to appeal to the Roman audience. Okay. Not exactly and not specifically, but there was a lot to that, right? So what you found in Christianity, let me just kind of point this out and then I'll circle back to that. What you find is that as Christianity spread out away from Jerusalem, it started to take on the flavor of the country that it was in. And so if you're in Jerusalem, it has a very kind of ancient Hebrew feel to it. As you go up into Syria, it started to change a little bit. And as you got closer and closer to Rome, it starts to take Egypt. It's going to start taking on more of the Gnostic kind of version and Coptic. There's going to be other elements to this. And what I find very fascinating is that when I watch some of these movies, when you're trying to depict Jesus in a very specific light in accordance to the Gospels, what I keep finding is that it looks more and more Roman. When you start branching away from that, I feel that there seems to be more of an authenticity to Jesus's character. I think, if Jesus is depicted in a particular way that I think is very different, I would imagine that he would be depicted as, a little bit more dirty because, he's walking around all the time. How often is he taking a bath? Probably not very much. You'd think that maybe there's a lot of joy in what he's doing, and I would imagine there probably was, but at the same time, you're walking, 15, 20 miles a day. That's pretty tough. So how big of a smile do you have? You're always interacting with the people around you and then the new people that you're engaging with. So I think that if you kind of start breaking all of these pieces down, Jesus is, a very complex character. And I don't think that some of the movies do him justice. I think that, maybe he had some doubts, but I don't think it was as doubtful like as in the Last Temptation of Christ. I think he was pretty much committed at that point, and he knew what was going on. My feeling is that he knew, so he, like I asked myself, everything happens either before going to John the Baptist or after John the Baptist. So what happened after the John the Baptist? So what do you learn while you're in ministry, and what do you bring to the table beforehand? Well, does he know God the Father before he goes to John the Baptist? If that's the case, then why go to John the Baptist? If it's not the case, how do you then all of a sudden you get transformed to be able to conduct this ministry? It kind of was a bit of a catch-22 with me. So I just figured that Jesus is bringing God the Father with him, and then he goes to see John, then he goes out into the desert, and the next thing you know, he's kind of on his ministry. And at that point, I don't think that he is doubting like you see in the Last Temptation of Christ. I think he's totally committed because he keeps saying, the more I be, the less I become, the more the Father is in me. So I think that level of doubt in that movie is probably not very accurate, and then for him to go to Mary Magdalene kind of wondering, like, what am I supposed to do? I know what that was like when I was, in my 20s. And I would imagine, Jesus is not displaying that level of doubt or confusion. He seems to be more directed. In fact, Jesus that I was able to understand was the surgeon. He was completely focused on at every moment what he wanted to do and what he wanted to say. And he was highly inventive. So he's inventing things along the way. So I don't see any of that in any of the movies. I don't see him grappling with, because I've done some writing, so I know what it's like to sit down and try to write something. And Jesus is making these very long and complicated parables. Well, I'm sure he had to go through an editing process. He can't just like come out and then keep saying it. He probably went, hey, you know what? This is not working, or this is working. Let me try this on this audience and see how that goes. And so I'm sure there was kind of a back and forth process of him developing his sayings and those parables. I don't think that he just like willy-nilly just came up with them on the fly. I think he was developing them. And he had, he developed like 10, 15 or 20 of them. But I don't see any of that in the story. And I don't see any in the Gospel of Thomas. Thomas states right off the bat, I think it's either line 1 or line 2. It says, these are the words that Jesus said and that were recorded by me. So, wow. So do we see anybody, like writing things down that, Jesus said? There were 25, I found 25 pages. Somebody had to write something down.
And yeah, the writing is always interesting as far as when it was written, all the books. Because,
Yeah. The first gospel was roughly 40 years after Jesus died, between 35 and 40 years. So who's writing those? Okay. If you have Jesus, he's the first one. Then you have his disciples. So he's part of, they're part of the 1.0 group, right? Well, Mark never met Jesus. So he has to be at least 0.2, you know, Paul, 2, maybe 3. He's a couple of versions down the road.
Right.
All of them are down the road from what Jesus actually did. So that meant that everything that was being discussed is, either from the actual disciples themselves or stories from stories. And then once now that gets into a whole new kind of a ball game. And then who's editing these things? If you go through and you look at the synoptic gospels, there are a lot of parallels and a lot of similarity, and yet there are differences. So Mark seems to be the first one. Mark has a certain structure to it in which Jesus says a couple of things, and then he walks, and then he says some more things, and then he walks, and then he says some more things, and he walks. Okay, so it's walk, say, walk, say, walk, say, right? When you get into Matthew and Luke, there are other stories. There's Jesus's birth. There's Jesus, what Jesus did over here and what he did over here. And then finally at the very end of what happened to him, and then, the death and resurrection. So there are stories that are developing. The question is whether or not those stories were original stories. But they're original to the context of what it is that they were trying to say. So that's down the road. That's downstream. And then after that, it gets even more refined and edited.
One pretty big hint that there was a lot of editing going on is we're always finding like lost books or lost chapters.
Yes.
And so right there, I think that shows that there was at least some type of editing going on by obviously probably the churches and stuff like that.
Well, and here's the other thing is that as these are being written, now we need somebody to copy them. So you need to describe, right? Because there's no Xerox, there's no fax machines, there's no copy machines. Somebody had to do that. So how accurate are they as they're writing this? And gee, you know what? This audience over here is not going to like this story. So let's just edit it out and, create something different.
Mm-hmm.
To get, to appeal to those people. So audience now becomes really important. In fact, that was really one of the things that happened to me was, your Facebook followers, how many followers can you get and how many people can you appeal to? So there must have been something that Jesus was saying that had an appeal to certain people. And what was that? So, and then it's because it's not what the priests wanted. Nicodemus seems to be one of the few that was wealthy and was interested in some of the things that Jesus was saying.
Before we end off, there was just one last question I wanted to ask, and more, it came up today because we kept saying Kingdom of Heaven. Have you seen the movie Kingdom of Heaven, and what did you think of it if you did?
I don't think I saw it.
Okay. It's with Orlando Bloom and Liam Neeson. I think it's mainly, if I remember correct, it's about the Holy Wars.
Oh, if that's the one, yeah. So that's the Crusades, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So now we have, think of it this way, when we're telling stories. If we're going to tell a story about the Crusades, what are we going to put in it? And what are we going to leave out? And you can only tell the story because you need to have a couple of components that are compelling components to keep the story that you're driving, right? Because you want to deal with the climax of the story. What are those components that you want to tell? You can't just do a big shotgun, look at any of this stuff. That's the thing about a story, is that a story is very focused on the way it is told and what it is telling. So you can't add part A, part B, part C, subpart D of C. You can't keep doing that because then it just starts mixing up the story. So how do you distill a story and make it compelling that you can, as you know, we're now saying, hey, you got 15 seconds. Tell me about your book. You got 15 seconds. That's called the elevator pitch. Well, you got the same issue. It's just a little longer than an elevator pitch. You got a half a minute or, a minute. You better be on your game to tell that story. And it better be very interesting as well, because people's attention spans seem to, well, at least for us, it's very short.
Right. Yeah. No, as content creators ourselves, me and Sam, we definitely have seen that. It used to be like long form videos was like the cool thing. And then recently it's been like, hey, 15-second videos is what people want to watch. They don't want to
Right.
watch these. And now it's kind of going secular, because now it's coming around in podcasts so I don't know, maybe our attention spans will get better at some point.
Attention spans. And one is the house that I did some remodeling in LA. I did the whole backyard, and I built a deck, and I built some gardens and walls, and it was, to me it was really kind of amazing, and it took like 6 months to do or more. And when we sold the house, my wife and I happened to be out in the backyard. We weren't supposed to be there, but we were there anyway, just kind of checking people out and what they thought. And this one guy opens up the sliding glass door to the backyard, steps onto the landing, turns his head, to the right, then turns his head to the left. That was enough. And he walked right back in. So 6 months of my time to build all this stuff, he looked at and said, this is only worth 10 seconds of my time. And I thought, wow, what a trip. So yeah, try telling a story that's compelling to get people's attention.
Yeah.
So part of the telling of the story is to, generate fear. Well, if you don't believe in this, you're going to go to hell. Uh-oh, I better listen a little bit more carefully now. My ears are perked.
This has been really fascinating. We definitely, at least I know I want to have you come back on because there's so much more we could talk about. But
Yes.
I hope that that we get a lot of viewers going to your stuff, and this is the point where I want them to know where they can find it, as far as your book and some websites or stuff like that.
Okay, so I've had a little falling out with my publisher, so it's no longer on Amazon. So anyway, you can't get my book. And if I am going to redo that, I'll have to do a second edition. And that kind of raises up a few other things. Anyway, I do have a website. It's called davidcollis.com. And it's really kind of about my art at the moment. And then I also, I'm on Facebook at David C. Collis.
I've enjoyed this. This is one that when Mark, was talking about you, this was a episode I really wanted to talk about just because it was such a different take, I think, on how people write a book about Jesus.
Thank you, because that's how I felt. Like, okay, what is the person behind the mask?
Mm-hmm.
What does he look like, right? And so theology is a veil, and it shows Jesus in one light. But I wanted to get beyond that to understand, like, man was making decisions. He had to evolve. I mean, he started in one place and went to someplace else. So, when I've actually been called a heretic for saying that Jesus evolved. So to me, that was like, it's totally a non-brainer.
Well, here's one last question. How have people taken your book as far as if they're really religious or if they're not really religious?
What I found is that people who are very strong Christians do not like my book because obviously I talk about Jesus's humanity and primarily his humanity. And so it counters what they believe in, right? Because I'm not interested in belief so much as I'm trying to explore the possibility of what Jesus looked like that's beyond, that's, on the other side of this theological veil. There was a monk, a Christian monk, who loved my book, who said he's never, he was so intrigued and fascinated that he was able to get a picture of Jesus that he couldn't get while he was, a monk. That I loved. I've had people who were, Catholics or, born again Christians who have now left their faith, have read my book and just loved it. And then there are others who are kind of religious, and they found certain parts of the book really, really inspiring. And so a friend of mine, she just was praising my last chapter on Jesus's death and what that meant to her. So I have a gamut, and I feel like the audience isn't just gigantic. I thought it had the potential for being something very large, but what I found is that people's preconceptions and prejudices get in the way.
Mhm.
So it's very difficult for people to, well, I'm a spiritual person and Jesus has too much baggage, so I don't want anything to do with that. So that's one group of people. And then the other group of people are, I'm a Christian and this doesn't comport with my Christianity, so I don't want to have anything to do. And then there's somebody in the middle, right? And that audience, there's an audience out there, but I thought it would be bigger.
Oh, and hopefully we can at least introduce some new viewers to you, because like I said, it was very, very interesting. I'll be doing a review of the book that I got, so I'm glad I got it
Oh,
when I got
fantastic.
it. Because you were like, it's not on Amazon. I was like, oh, well, I feel
Yeah,
lucky that I bought it then.
yeah, my publisher and I kind of separated. So, and with that meant that Amazon doesn't get it.
Well, when you hopefully make a second edition, I will make sure to notify the viewers, and that way
Okay,
they can go pick it up. But yeah, no,
fantastic.
no, it's been great talking to you, and I hope to talk to you again soon. Just because there's just so much more to talk about. I mean, it's hard to cram it. Even in the 2 hours we've talked, there's just too much information.
Always a lot.
There's a lot to this.
Mm-hmm.
Once again, Sam and I want to both say thank you to David for joining us. This was a really fantastic episode, one that, like I said earlier, I was really looking forward to. So thank you again, David, for joining us. Make sure you go check out his website in the link in the description below. Until next time, though, for more Culz interviews, click that link to your left. For more about what we're doing here at Culz Paranormal, click that link to your right. And don't forget to hit that like and give us a subscribe. And let us know, A, have you read David's book? And B, what did you take away from this interview?